Welcome to the first China in Context of 2025 from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. Another year, another Donald Trump presidency. In this episode, we're looking at the prospects for relations between China and the US under the new administration. President Trump has threatened Beijing with significant trade tariffs and has nominated cabinet members who take a hawkish line, such as Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who sees China as America's biggest threat, along with others, including Elon Musk, who has significant investments in China. Well, later we'll be hearing from Professor Evan Medeiros, former senior advisor on China during the Obama administration. But first, I'm joined by Professor Miles Yu, a military historian who is currently the director of the China Center at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and was principal advisor on China policy to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo during Donald Trump's first term. Professor Yu, thank you very much for talking to us on China in Context. What do you think Donald Trump's choice of officials and advisors tells us about the likely direction of his China policy over the coming years?
Well, many people think Donald Trump is a myth. It's a riddle. To me, it's very clear. I mean, just listen to what he said and what he does. And it's a very, very transparent. First of all, he is the America First president. When he says that, he really means that. What does American First mean? That is, he's going to reestablish or maintain Americans' preeminence in the world as the global leader. So that could mean many ways, right? One is economic preeminence. Secondly, military preeminence. And thirdly, I think in terms of prestige, I mean, he wants America to be respected again. In specific term, that would mean basically he's going to emphasize overwhelmingly on deterrence rather than management. Deterrence is to prevent bad things from happening before it happens. For example, wars or nuclear escalation, and deterrence is very important. And it worked. During the first term, President Trump used deterrence with skills, and the world was very safe. There was no invasion of any sort in Europe. There was no kind of blow-ups in the Middle East. And Taiwan Strait remained very calm. So that's because Donald Trump promised massive retaliation if bad guys does bad things.
Obviously, people are waiting to be confirmed, such as Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. And we've also got Elon Musk in the administration. Do you see a sort of a balance within the administration of people who are very hawkish on China and some people who have either their own business interests in China or take a more kind of corporate approach to dealing with Beijing?
I think that it's pretty balanced. You mentioned about Senator Marco Rubio. I think that's his best pick so far. By that, I mean he understands communism. His parents came from Cuba, Castro's Cuba. So that's why I think Senator Rubio's understanding of the Chinese regime is one step above the average. So I'm very hopeful that he will continue the China policy we set up during the first Trump term. So I feel very robust about that. And I think so far, his national security team, particularly on China front, has been all uniformly very good and very strong. Now, you mentioned Elon Musk. Now, Elon Musk obviously has a business interest in China, but also he has business interest many, many times over in the United States. I mean, he is a patriot. His Tesla plant in China and Tesla brand as a whole are not really treated very fairly inside China as well, because the Chinese government has all kinds of measures against him. So I think Elon Musk obviously admired the diligence, hardworking ethics of Chinese workers, and that's business. On the other hand, on the policy side, I don't think Elon Musk is completely against United States interests. So I'm sure that he also has something that Chinese government is quite afraid of. For example, his Starlink that has a potential to take down China's Great Firewall. It's basically a satellite Wi-Fi without much of the government interference possibilities. Keep in mind, Elon Musk played a role in the incoming administration, not in the foreign policy and the global strategy, mostly in domestic reform. His role is to enhance government efficiency. So I don't think President Trump will allow him to impact the U.S. policy toward China or international relationship for that matter.
So overall, you're saying that you see a balance within his team that he's picked. I mean, from your experience working with Mike Pompeo when he was Secretary of State and being close to the administration, how far do you think that Donald Trump really listens to the experts? How far does he listen to the State Department? How far does he listen to his national security advisors on key issues?
I think that Donald Trump's team, particularly Secretary Pompeo, they are not only good, courageous practitioners of public diplomacy, they're also good listeners. They listen to the right kind of experts on major issues, particularly like COVID, for example. The president and Secretary Pompeo listen to experts, and we're the first to issue a travel ban from China. So that's very, very early, I believe, the end of January 2020. If you look at the today's the second term, the Trump administration, they basically continue the understanding that our number one national security threat comes from China. And that has not changed at all. Secondly, they have a much bigger plan to tackle China from a global perspective. That's why you hear President Donald Trump, even before his inauguration, started talking about acquisition of Panama, about Greenland. Those are all China related. So it is a very strategic from a global perspective, not this kind of piecemeal approach to solving the China problem.
At the same time, Donald Trump has spoken often about, his belief in the power of personal relationships. We saw him initially trying to cultivate a strong relationship with President Xi. In his last term, we saw his attempts at talks with Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime. Do you think that factor, which some people see as has the potential for leading to unpredictability in his policies, do you still see that as something that he's going to try to pursue?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you have to really engage with the adversary to prevent the kinetic fighting. That's not good for either side. So I don't see any reason for Donald Trump not to talk to Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and even Vladimir Putin, for that matter, because those are a serious threat to the United States to world peace. So I think that Donald Trump knows how to deter those guys without basically provoking them to the brink of war.
President Biden was actually very specific in his comments on Taiwan in particular, saying that, if China took military action, the US would respond in kind. Many people saw that as an abandoning of the long-term policy of strategic ambiguity. Where do you see that Donald Trump will stand on this issue? I mean, clearly some people in Taiwan are optimistic about his picks for Secretary of State and his general attitude, but others are worried that he might put too much emphasis from their point of view on developing a close relationship with the Chinese leadership. What do you think this means for Taiwan? And I believe you've just been to Taiwan and talked to many of the senior people there.
Well, if you're a Chinese leader, you will never believe there is such a thing called strategic ambiguity. Every time China tries to test the resolve of Americans' commitment to the defense of Taiwan, American president always make clear to the Chinese, we're going to get militarily involved. The idea of strategically, militarily ambiguous when China invests Taiwan is just not really real. Is there any ambiguity about Taiwan? Yes, but not military, not defense, not strategic, but diplomatic. The United States has had diplomatic ambiguity about Taiwan's status. We have not resolved that. Hopefully, during the second term of the Trump administration, that issue will go away because ambiguity of any sort is very dangerous. It's provocative. Ambiguity breeds conflict.
So do you expect that there will be some move to more formally recognize Taiwan? I mean, that's not going to happen, surely.
Well, anything can happen. President Donald Trump hasn't said that so explicitly, but his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has championed that very strongly. I mean, I was there with him when he was in Taiwan in 2022, making that announcement that he personally urged U.S. government to recognize Taiwan as a sovereign and independent country. Hopefully, that ambiguity, that unresolved status, will be resolved pretty soon.
And in terms of Taiwan and its defense, Donald Trump has talked about Taiwan and other US allies obviously needing to pay more for their own defense. And there's been talk of further US weapons sales to Taiwan. Do you think that that's what Taiwan needs? I mean, some people on the island have said that actually Taiwan is coming under pressure to buy expensive military hardware that it may not really need so much in an age of asymmetric warfare. Is your feeling that the policy towards Taiwan and its defense is correct, or is it partly based on the US need for greater weapons sales?
But I think overall, Taiwanese government is determined to buy more American weapons for their own needs. Americans is not imposing Taiwan on buying certain items. Of course, if you're a defense contractor, you have that kind of talk, but it's not American policy per se. American policy toward Taiwan's defense is through mutual consultation, to buy what Taiwan really needs. And I think so far it's pretty good. Another issue is that Donald Trump asked Taiwan to pay more. That's nothing new. Donald Trump has also asked the NATO's, even UK, to pay more. And to ask the Japanese, the Koreans to pay more. So, in the case of Taiwan, it actually means less pressure for the Taiwanese because there's no forward deploy troops in Taiwan. So I think it's a win-win.
And obviously, in terms of Donald Trump's attitude to Beijing itself, he has spoken during his election campaign about the potential for very high tariffs. And we've also already seen restrictions under the Biden administration as well on the sales of high-tech US, particularly semiconductors and other products that China would need for its own industry. Do you expect to see something of a trade war this time, or do you think that Donald Trump is once again sort of using these threats to try and get a deal?
Well, I think the entire approach to the so-called Donald Trump trade war with China has been misguided because it is not Donald Trump that waged trade war against China.
Do you
China
mean
has been imposing tariffs on the entire world. It's been subsidizing its key exports. So China has been waging trade war on the whole world, particularly on the United States. So whatever Donald Trump has been doing is been very responsive rather than proactive. So as far as second term of Donald Trump's trade policy, I think it's continuation of the first term, and also in certain aspect, you mentioned about the export control on high-tech items. That's true. I think we're going to enhance that. I think the Biden team also actually did a pretty good job in that front, but it's not enough. And most importantly, the second term, I think the Trump administration will be less restricted and hampered by the trade deal, because the first term, I think the United States government wasted a lot of time to force China to reach a trade deal. Once the trade deal was signed, and then the COVID hit the United States, and then nothing was implemented. So I don't think Donald Trump has any more illusion about negotiating with China in a very substantial way. So he's going to be more focused and force China to change the behavior and to protect America, to protect the world, in my view.
But how do you think Beijing will respond to Trump possibly attempting to take a very hard line on trade?
I think that the only way out of this thing is to reduce its hardline attitude toward the United States.
But do you think that China's economic situation is such that it will realize or it will feel that it does need to make some compromises then at the current moment?
I think China is divided. The leadership is divided. Number one, you got Xi Jinping, who basically is like an ostrich, stick his head into the sand and doesn't care whatever is going on outside. And then number two, and I think that there are some really practical leaders at some level below Xi Jinping who realize this kind of foolhardiness is really harmful to China's self-interest. Hopefully, the sane and sage voice will prevail. But right now, I don't see the hope.
So overall, perhaps just to sum up, where do you feel US-China relations are likely to be in 4 years' time after this Donald Trump administration has been in office?
I think that's a very good question. I mean, nobody has a crystal ball on what's going to happen 4 years from now. But what I can guess is that it depends on many factors. Number one is China's internal situation. I think China is a very volatile society. Its economy is in the tanks. Its leadership is very paranoid. So what will happen in 4 years' time, to a larger degree, depends on how China will evolve domestically. Secondly, I think it will also depends on how United States, to what extent the United States can restore its global preeminence. So what I'm saying is America is going to push back. So this kind of counteroffensive, I think, is going to take shape pretty soon.
Professor Yu, thank you so much for joining us on China in Context here at the SOAS China Institute.
Well, thank you very much, and God bless the King.
Well, we're joined now by Professor Evan Medeiros, the Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and also former Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, I believe, at the White House National Security Council, and a special assistant to the president during the Obama administration. And apart from all of that, Evan, you're actually a graduate of SOAS, I believe.
I am. I did the master's in Chinese studies in the late 1990s at SOAS.
So thank you so much for joining us now on China in Context. Over the last couple of years, there's been quite a lot of talk in the US that there's actually now something of a pretty general bipartisan consensus on China in US politics, that both parties support a pretty hard line. The Biden administration in many ways continued some of those tariffs and restrictions on Chinese high-tech companies, which had first been introduced under the Trump administration, or at least first talked about, less so perhaps under the previous Obama administration. We've also seen just recently, more restrictions on exports of AI. There's this TikTok ban that's just being given its final review by the Supreme Court at the time of recording. At least it might actually be in place before the inauguration. Do you think that US policy towards China will actually change significantly under Donald Trump, or in fact, is it likely to be more of a continuation?
The obvious answer is it will be both. In other words, you're right that there is a consensus in Washington. The consensus is much more about the nature of the challenge than what to do about the challenge. In other words, there's agreement across the political spectrum that China presents a substantial and enduring challenge to a variety of American economic, security, technological interests. Where there continues to be disagreement, and there is not yet a consensus, is what to do about it. And political parties disagree, experts disagree about how to address the nature of the China challenge. But I think that conversation about what to do is going to evolve further under Donald Trump, because the presumption is he's going to adopt even more competitive and confrontational policies toward China than the Biden administration.
Yeah, I mean, we heard earlier from Professor Miles Yu, who implied that there could be a pretty, hardline approach towards China, and that Donald Trump is less likely to be willing to sort of negotiate in the early stages than he was in his first administration. Looking at the people that he's brought into the administration, obviously their nominations also still going through at the time of recording. It looks like he's got some pretty hardline anti-China hawks, we could say, like Marco Rubio. But there are also people like Elon Musk, who's obviously got significant investments in China. Howard Lutnick, the proposed Commerce Secretary, has talked about the possibility of deals with China. What is your feeling about the sort of balance of all of this? Who will have the most influence on Donald Trump's policy? And indeed, do you think Trump will listen to these people and listen to advisors, or will he just go his own way?
Well, Donald Trump will always go his own way. I think the big question for China policy in the first year is precisely the dilemma that you outlined, which is, on the one hand, you have a group of economic nationalists and national security hawks like Marco Rubio, Peter Navarro, who are likely want to take a very, very confrontational policy toward China. And on the other hand, you've got sort of moderate economic advisors, Commerce Secretary, Treasury Secretary, and then, of course, business leaders. You've got people like Elon Musk, you've got financiers like Steve Schwartzman, and the question is, what is the balance of these going to be? I mean, it's Donald Trump, so it's likely to be a little bit of both. There's likely to be volatility going back and forth, but at the end of the day, when you listen to how he thinks about the world and the U.S. role in the world, like, you know, his comments about Denmark, his comments about Panama Canal, underlying a lot of this appears to be this deep concern about geopolitical competition with China and trying to maximize the U.S. ability to control critical trade choke points like the Panama Canal or sources of critical minerals like Greenland. If I had to make a bet, I would bet on a much more competitive policy.
What do you see they will actually do in practical terms? There's been talk of imposing 60% tariffs on imports from China to the US.
So I think in practical terms, on day one, we're not likely to see 60% tariffs on China. I think what the Trump administration will do is gradually, incrementally ratchet up pressure on China to generate leverage and to see what the room to negotiate is. But the big question that a lot of Americans have, and I know a lot of Chinese have, is, so what does Donald Trump want from the Chinese, right? And that remains a big open question. I think, you know, Elon Musk would have an answer to that question, but Peter Navarro would have a very, very different answer to the question, right? The economic nationalists want China to fundamentally change the structure of their economy, roll back the role of state-owned enterprises, roll back subsidies, and all the things that.
So Peter Navarro, just to say, being the former advisor in the last administration who really wants a sort of decoupling from China, is that would be right? Fair to say? Yeah.
That's right. So I think that the real question for Donald Trump is, what is his game plan? Because he likes tariffs, but what does he seek to gain from them? In the last administration, they tried to get China to massively increase purchases of agriculture, of energy, you know, Boeing planes, and that didn't work out so well. And so it's not clear what they're going to ask this time around, and also what Beijing is prepared to give. Because, and this may be the most important point I make on the podcast, unlike in the first Trump administration, the Chinese have developed a bigger, broader, more sophisticated toolkit of retaliation measures, because they can't go one for one with tariffs, simply given the scale of their exports to the United States. It's not in their interest. But what they've done is put together a whole series of tools, let's loosely call them export control rules, that can really impose very specific costs on American companies and American consumers.
And is this things like the mineral exports that we've seen recently, China imposing controls on some of these key minerals that are used in high-tech industries?
Yeah, that's probably the best example. The fact that in retaliation for the most recent Biden administration controls on chip exports, advanced AI chip exports to China, the Chinese response was, okay, we're not going to sell you gallium, germanium, antimony, and other critical minerals that you need as you build out your semiconductor supply chain.
So if both sides are quite likely, as you suggest, to take tit for tat measures, we could call them, Do you see that at some point there would be a kind of a balancing point or a compromise where, there might be some tariffs from the US side, but it won't be as high as Trump has threatened, for example, or is this a deeper problem, and are we looking at more of a real all-out trade war?
Well, because it's Donald Trump, I do think that it will ultimately reach, a point where both sides decide to stop the escalation because it's costly, it's risky, it's probably very inflationary for the United States, which Donald Trump will not like. Um, and ultimately they negotiate a ceasefire. But that's the best case scenario, Duncan, right? And it's certainly not guaranteed because Donald Trump is very unpredictable. But one difference from Donald Trump from his previous administration is he's never articulated a view, a strategic view that America needs to decouple from China. So
He himself, unlike some of his
correct. Donald
advisors, you
Trump
mean? Yeah.
himself personally. So whereas in the first administration, you had people like the trade representative, Robert Lighthizer, who wanted to use tariffs and other economic measures to decouple the two economies. Donald Trump has never articulated that view. But of course, he has surrounded himself with some economic nationalists. So again, it ultimately comes down to what ideas are swirling around in Donald Trump's head. What costs is he willing to pay to reach some kind of new equilibrium in the US-China relationship?
Well, one of the other obviously key elements of the U.S.-China relationship is Taiwan and the U.S. attitude to Taiwan, and obviously in the context of China taking a much more assertive stance about sovereignty over Taiwan. We've seen now people like Marco Rubio, who over the last few years has been a very outspoken pro-Taiwan voice on Capitol Hill and has pushed legislation through Congress. But there are people in Taiwan who I think are concerned that Donald Trump's potential for trying to strike up a strong personal relationship with Xi Jinping could in some way undermine the US commitment to defending Taiwan. And there's obviously been talk about Taiwan needing to spend more money on its own defense from Trump and his allies. So, do you think overall Taiwan should be reassured by this administration, or should it actually be concerned about what might happen?
Well, I can tell you, Taiwan officials and Taiwan experts that I talk to are very concerned about Donald Trump because in his first administration, he said things like, I don't really care about Taiwan. Now, his views on Taiwan appear to have evolved, but they've not necessarily evolved in a reassuring direction for Taiwan, right? He notably during the campaign talked about his belief that Taiwan, quote, stole semiconductor chip technology from the United States, right? He's talked about how the U.S. does so much for Taiwan's defense. Is Taiwan doing enough for itself? And he's nominated some pretty conservative folks to senior positions like Elbridge Colby, who have articulated this very view before, which is Taiwan needs to do more for itself before the United States is going to sell it more arms and commit to its defense. So I think Taiwan is very concerned. And it's changed the dynamic. It's now Taiwan trying to assure Washington that it's taking very seriously its need to improve its defense capabilities, and they're making the investments and they're spending the money, et cetera, et cetera. But I think Taiwan is quite nervous.
You mentioned the question of semiconductors, and Donald Trump has said that, as you suggested, this idea that Taiwan kind of stole the U.S. Chip industry or semiconductor industry, and there's been much talk about putting pressure on Taiwan Semiconductor, TSMC, which is the world's largest chip maker, and is crucial to the US defense industry, for example, to pressurize them to move their production or much of their production to other countries, and particularly to the US. Do you think this is something that is a realistic aim or a realistic
Well, it's already
ambition?
happening.
Yeah.
TSMC is famously in the process of building a semiconductor fab in Arizona right now. So that's already happening. So, but it's Donald Trump, right? He always wants a better deal than his predecessor. So I think it's entirely possible that he'll pressure TSMC to build a second facility in the United States, in another state. And he'll pressure TSMC to build more advanced chips. Taiwan's not building its most advanced chips in the United States. Perhaps Trump will do that. So I think that's entirely possible. And that's all part of this broad package of sort of renegotiating the terms of the US-Taiwan relationship, because Trump feels like Taiwan owes the US for all that it's done to protect its defense. I think it's going to come down to a negotiation between the government of Taiwan and TSMC and other chip providers about how much they're prepared to give the United States to ensure continuity in America's sort of de facto commitments to defend Taiwan.
I mean, presumably one of the concerns for people in Taiwan is the sense that Donald Trump is less perhaps ideologically concerned about, visibly supporting vibrant democracies, as Taiwan supporters often describe it, and that he is more transactional. He is perhaps more willing to talk to Beijing if there's an advantage for him. Is that something that the people you've spoken to in Taiwan are sort of worried about as well at the moment?
Well, there's no evidence that Donald Trump looks at Taiwan as a vibrant democracy and sees protecting the principle of self-determination and protecting a vibrant democracy from invasion from an autocracy. There's no evidence that Donald Trump sees the Taiwan question in those terms, and I think that worries them enormously.
And you mentioned this question of, for example, Taiwan being seen as needing to pay more for its defense. And there has also been talk of South Korea needing to pay more for having US troops based there. And with the current tensions around North Korea, clearly that could be a potential flashpoint. Do you see overall, with people like Marco Rubio in the administration, that the Trump administration will still be generally committed to keeping up the US role in East Asia, and to things like withstanding China's more assertive policies in the South China Sea?
The national security hawks in the Trump administration are absolutely committed to the US alliance system, and they understand the importance of reaffirming the credibility of American security commitments. The question becomes whether or not Donald Trump shares those views, right? Is he willing to back the Philippines if it gets into a conflict over the second Thomas Shoal? What are Trump's views on whether or not to risk major conflict with China over, these very, very small features in the South China Sea? The answer to that is unknown. One of the most consistent themes of Trump's view of the world is he looks at alliances as an unequal deal where our allies get more from us than we get from them. So he famously puts pressure on allies, even, among our strongest, most capable allies in Asia, Japan and South Korea, to do more and pay more. And so I think our alliances in Asia will very likely come under pressure. Now, Trump's advisors may not agree with that approach, but this is one of the most consistent themes of Donald Trump's view of the world going back well into the 1980s, when he was, a young businessman in New York, when Japan Inc. was all the rage and he thought the Japanese were fleecing us.
Going back to Beijing, you mentioned that the Chinese government or the Chinese administration may have more tools in its toolbox for sort of dealing with Trump and the threat of tariffs. And I wonder if you think that they will take a different attitude to him in general, that they see him as more of a known quantity now, or do you think they hope they can get some kind of a deal with him? Because clearly, that's something that would perhaps concern US regional allies.
I agree. The Chinese definitely believe that they know Donald Trump now better than before. I just wrote an op-ed in the FT about this precise point. The Chinese look at Trump and they say, number one, we're not going to try and pursue the romantic ideal of a personal relationship between Trump and Xi Jinping. like they did in the first term. There's not going to be any trip to Mar-a-Lago. There's not going to be any big piece of chocolate cake. Their view is, we're happy to have a business relationship with you, but it's going to be strictly business. If you impose penalties on us, we're going to impose penalties on you. It's going to be tit for tat, and the toolkit at our disposal is bigger and broader, and our ability to impose very directed pain on you is much greater than before. Now, the Chinese are happy to negotiate a deal, but they're only going to do a deal if they think it's in their interests. And they were pretty chastened by what they believed was a pretty crappy deal that they negotiated in the first term. And their interest in the deal is simply because they don't want to unnecessarily harm their economy. They don't want to unnecessarily create volatility in international energy markets and international financial markets. But the Chinese I talk to say that we're also prepared to withstand the risks and costs associated with a US-China economic conflict if need be.
Even in the context of China facing a slowing economy in the post-COVID era, you think that they're ready to sort of stand up.
Here's the interesting dimension of that. I think that the Chinese are acutely aware of their current macroeconomic situation, but their view is that it's short term, that they're making adjustments. That's one of the reasons why there has been a renewed focus on both fiscal and monetary stimulus in Beijing, including, what to date has been a third rail of Chinese economic policy making, which is consumer stimulus. The Chinese are preparing their economy for this sort of economic competition, economic confrontation with the United States. So their view is, yes, it's not ideal to do this right now, given the nature of their economy, but it won't fundamentally disrupt the structural changes Xi Jinping is trying to make. And the Chinese view is our ability to retaliate is better. The Americans will be surprised, and we're happy to engage in limited target conflict because we think ultimately the Americans will not be able to withstand the economic pain that the Chinese are going to impose, and as a result will ultimately reach some kind of ceasefire, some kind of deal.
I mean, we've also seen President Xi Jinping talking to the president of the European Council in recent days. Is there a chance that we may see some sort of rebalancing where China tries to improve its relations with the EU as a kind of counterweight to pressure from the US?
Yes, I mean, this has been China's strategy in dealing with the United States, US-China economic competition for a very, very long time. The challenge the Chinese have is the tools at their disposal to try and reset their economic relations with the European Union or Japan or South Korea or Southeast Asia are somewhat limited, given the structural changes they're trying to make to their economy. So the question for the Chinese really is, are they willing to make the concessions that the European Union wants them to make? Like voluntary export restraints on EV exports. Xi Jinping's growth model is increasingly dependent on exports, and especially exporting excess industrial capacity that the domestic market is not yet big enough to absorb. The problem is that creates all sorts of antibodies in markets throughout the world, because the Chinese are just dumping electric vehicles or solar panels or other types of clean energy technologies in ways that displace local producers and create a relationship of dependency. So the Chinese are going to have to sort of choose between two interests. On the one hand, they want to improve their diplomatic geopolitical ties with countries all over the world as a hedge against a more aggressive, assertive the United States. On the other hand, to do that requires them to alter some of the structural changes in their economy, this very manufacturing intensive growth model that Xi Jinping is pursuing. And the Chinese are going to have to choose between two interests that are both very important to them. And I think that's going to be a real strategic turning point for Xi Jinping.
And I mean, we are obviously hearing from people like Professor Miles Yu and others close to the Trump administration that, the US will seek to pressurize countries around the world to join them in taking a tougher line on China, and the EU is clearly one target of that. I mean, do you think that that's going to happen in reality?
I mean, the US is already doing this, but yes, Trump will amp it up. The core strategic challenge for the Trump administration is, what is the United States prepared to offer as an alternative to trade and investment from China? Threatening to invade Panama and take over the Panama Canal does not look like a terribly persuasive approach. And so the question is what is the Trump administration prepared to give other countries to offer them? But just telling them not to work with China because China represents a strategic challenge, that's not enough.
I mean, if we are going to see a period of increased tension between the US and China, and as you say, that could have wider ramifications, how do you think that people will be affected? Things like educational exchanges between China and the US, which certainly in terms of Americans going to China has diminished significantly in recent years. Last time under the Trump administration, we also saw the expulsion of American journalists from China in response to Donald Trump classifying Chinese media operatives in America as being foreign agents. So I'm wondering how it will affect those types of exchanges. And of course, there is also the potential for perhaps more pressure on people of a Chinese background in the US. Where do you think this will leave us?
Well, you ask, how is it going to affect the US-China people-to-people relations? I think the answer is it will affect it pretty badly. I mean, as a professor, I believe in exchange of ideas, even with people you disagree with, to understand them, especially among students. And students on both sides in the United States and China want to talk with one another, want to debate. They often disagree, but it's an important part of the learning experience. And so what concerns me is that there may be more government pressure under the Trump administration to tamp down those kinds of scholarly exchanges and student exchanges, for fear that it represents national security threats. And so I think we should expect that dimension of the US-China relationship, the people to interactions, to probably suffer. And, and that's really unfortunate, because those interactions are a foundation of the relationship, right? And even if you're concerned, as I am, about the long-term competitive challenges posed by China, we still need to understand them. We still need to know what they're thinking about.
Do you think that in 4 years' time, we could be looking at quite a different picture in terms of, how Washington deals with Beijing and vice versa?
I do. I think we could. I worry that this could be an inflection point. When I look at the advisors around Donald Trump, when I look at the discussion in the Congress, it's possible that the US could take a series of actions and China would respond in a way that takes the relationship from one that is fundamentally competitive to one that could be fundamentally confrontational. The relevant analogy would be the US-Soviet experience in the 1950s.
Well, it's a topic that I'm sure we will be coming back to very frequently in the coming months and years. But for now, that's all we have time for. But Professor Evan Medeiros, thank you so much for joining us on China in Context.
Thank you, Duncan, and great to be back working with SOAS.
Well, you can find more information about events at the SOAS China Institute and read the latest articles on our blog on the SOAS website. That's soas.ac.uk. China in Context will be back in 2 weeks' time. Until then, thanks for listening and goodbye.